Glad to see so many new faces. Welcome to the new class of law students at the law school, and to folks from elsewhere in the university here to hear our speaker. And a special welcome to our new Dean, Liz McGill. Would you please stand, just since some people may not yet have met Liz. We're very happy to have her join us here at Stanford this year. So we have a tradition here of celebrating Constitution Day by bringing distinguished speakers from a wide variety of ways of life that touch on the Constitution. And tonight we have a speaker that I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce, Professor Stanley Fish. Professor Fish is one of America's foremost public intellectuals. I would doubt if there is anyone who has not read with relish or irritation some of his books, op-eds, or other works. He is the Davidson Kahn Distinguished University Professor of Humanities and Law at Florida International University. But he made his reputation, I would say, primarily at Duke, as a scholar of Milton, and then later one of the great literary theorists of the country. I think he described himself as an anti-foundationalist, but is very closely associated with, or at least was, I'm not sure anymore, with the idea with basically left postmodernism. The best portrait of him is, to my way of thinking, is in the satirical novels by David Lodge, where he appears as this absolutely wonderful and hilarious character, Morris Zapp. So if you haven't read those novels, that's the best way, I think, to get to know Stanley Fish. Well, more recently, he has moved from literary theory more narrowly to a much broader set of subjects, including constitutional law, where he's made major contributions, especially in the area of the First Amendment, with such books as There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too, or my personal favorite title, Is There a Text in This Class? But what I especially like about Stanley Fish is that he is a genuine contrarian. He's clashed with just about everybody about something, including, by the way, me, although I'm not sure that he'll remember our particular little disagreement. And he is utterly unpredictable, although long associated with the postmodern left. He's now a beloved regular at the annual Originalism Conference in San Diego. And after making conservatives mad for years, he's more recently made liberal academics mad with his forceful attacks on the political use of the classroom. We'll see who he gets mad tonight. Professor Fish.
Thank you very much. There it is. Good. Can you see that? Thank you very much, Professor McConnell. Professor McConnell appears always in the context of my praise prominently in the course that I'm teaching this year called Religion and the Law, where we read not only 1,000-page case book of cases, but we also read prominent voices in the debates about religion and the law, and Professor McConnell is certainly one of those. And in fact, I can say that this may be a surprise or an irritation, that in almost every instance in the specific debates that I've seen you enter into, that I'm on your side. So perhaps you can contemplate being on my side at some point. Now, is that light necessary? That one up there? Oh, that's the slide. Ooh. So I am reaping the reward of my own request. Well, let's see. No, but we have to have it, because we have to have the, yeah. All right. I'm sorry, but if I blink occasionally, move over? No, it's the light up. All right, let's forget about the light. I'll try to forget about the light. You try to forget about the light. This is a talk about academic freedom, which is a vexed subject. It's of interest to almost every academic. Every academic is likely to think that he or she has more academic freedom than exists in the world. Many academics, when anything happens that they don't like, or when someone tells them that there's something that they can't do, will cry academic freedom, invoking what they think to be a sacred phrase. Academic freedom is much discussed in the academic world. It is occasionally discussed in Supreme Court and lower court cases, but never has quite provided the direction that some academics believe is a birthright of entering the profession. So I'm going to cast a skeptical eye on academic freedom and on its claims, and I'm going to try to give you a sense of what approaches to academic freedom there are now in the academy and to some extent in the general public. The full title of this talk is Versions of Academic Freedom, from Professionalism to Revolution. And as you can see, and as I shall say in detail in a moment, there are, at least in my view, 5 schools of academic freedom. And I want to lay out what those schools are and, at least to some extent, tease out the implications that are attached to each one of them. In 2009, a British academic by the name of Terence Caron published an essay with this title, Academic Freedom in Justification of a Universal Ideal. Although it may not seem so at first glance, Caron's title is polemical, for it answers in advance the question most often posed in the literature about academic freedom, which is simply, how does one justify academic freedom? Or, in another form, why should members of a particular profession be granted privileges, latitudes, and exemptions not enjoyed by other students, by other citizens? Why, for example, should college and university professors be free to criticize their superiors in the hierarchy when employees in other workplaces might face discipline or dismissal if they did the same thing? Why should college and university professors be free to determine and design the conditions of their workplace, usually the classroom, while others in other fields must adhere to a blueprint laid down by a supervisor? And why should college and university professors be free to choose the direction of their research, while researchers who work for industry or the government must go down the paths mandated by their employers? The architects, at least in this country, of the doctrine of academic freedom were not unaware of these questions, and in anticipation of others raising them, they raised them themselves. Academic freedom, wrote the philosopher Arthur O. Lovejoy, might seem, quote, peculiar, chiefly in that the teacher is a salaried employee, and yet the freedom claimed for him implies a denial of the right of those who provide or administer the funds from which he is paid to control the content of his teaching. This is Lovejoy writing in 1930. This denial of the employer's control of the employee's behavior is peculiar, however, only if one thinks first that college and university teaching is a job like any other, and second, that college and university teachers work for a dean or a provost or a board of trustees. That way of thinking about the matter is directly challenged and rejected by the 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure, issued by the then fledgling American Association of University Professors. The 1915 Declaration is a founding document of which Lovejoy was a principal author, and it is a document that is, in many respects, still authoritative today. Here is a key sentence from that document. Quote, "The responsibility of the university teacher is primarily to the public itself and to the judgment of his own profession. And while, with respect to certain external conditions of his vocation, the teacher accepts a responsibility to the authorities of the institution in which he serves, in the essentials of his professional activity, his duty is to the wider public, to which the individual institution is also amenable." Now, you will notice in this sentence that there are 4 centers of interest: the public, the institution of the academy, the individual faculty member, and the individual college or university. What the Declaration is telling us is that the faculty member's allegiance is first to the public, an abstract entity that is not limited to a particular location. The faculty member's secondary allegiance is to the judgment of his own profession. But since, as the text itself observes, the profession's responsibility is to the public, it amounts to the same thing. Last in line is the actual college or university to which the faculty member is tied, it seems, by the slightest of ligatures. He must honor, quote, "the external conditions of his vocation," which I assume means conditions like showing up in class, assigning grades, and holding office hours. But since it is a vocation to which the faculty member is responsible, he will always have his eye on what is really essential, the universal ideal that underwrites and justifies his labors. Here in 1915 are the seeds of everything that will flower in the latter half of the 20th and in the 21st century. The key is the distinction between a job and a vocation. As you know, a job is defined by an agreement, often contractual, between a worker and a boss. You will do X and I will pay you Y, and if you fail to perform as stipulated, I will discipline or perhaps even dismiss you. But a vocation is a calling that issues from some higher, sometimes heavenly source. Responding to a vocation is less a matter of specific performance than of responsiveness to a spirit. And since a spirit, by definition, cannot be circumscribed within a formula, the question of what is and is not responsive to it admits of no simple answer. And it will always be possible to expand the boundary of the responsive until the spirit fills every available nook and cranny. The history of academic freedom since 1915 is in part the history of that expansion, as academic freedom is declared to be indistinguishable from and necessary for the flourishing of every positive value known to mankind. Here are just a few quotations from the essay by Karen I cited earlier. And these are quotations which have authors, but I'll just give you the quotations seriatim and allow you to feel their cumulative force. 1, academic freedom is to the academic profession what judicial independence is to judges, what freedom of conscience is to the clergy, what the protection of sources is to the journalists, and what the exercise of clinical judgment is to the doctor. 2, academic freedom is important to everyone's well-being, as well as being particularly pertinent to academics and their students. 3, a democratic society is hardly conceivable without academic freedom, an assertion to which I would flatly say, false. Next. 4, In a society that has a high regard for knowledge and universal values, the scope of academic freedom is wide. And finally, the sacred trust of the universities is to carry the torch of freedom. Oh. I thought perhaps the screen was objecting to that last quotation, which I will repeat. The sacred trust of the universities is to carry the torch of freedom. Notice that in this statement, freedom is not qualified by the adjective academic. And you can take it as a rule that the larger the claims made for academic freedom, the less will be the limiting force of that adjective. In the taxonomy that I will offer, the movement from the most conservative to the most radical view of academic freedom will be marked by the transfer of emphasis from the word academic, which names the local and specific habitation of the asserted freedom, to the word freedom, which does not limit the scope or place of what is being asserted at all. So freedom becomes larger and larger, academic smaller and smaller. Of course, freedom is itself a contested concept and has many possible meanings. Another British academic, Graham Moody, sought some of these meanings out. I always wanted to be named Graham Moody or something like that. Those British academics have wonderful names. All right. Graham Moody sorts out some of the contested meanings of freedom and defines the freedom academics might reasonably enjoy in terms more modest and limited than those suggested by the authors cited by Karen. Moody notes that freedom is often understood, quote, as the absence of constraint, unquote. But that, he argues, would be too broad an understanding if it were applied to the activities of academics. Instead, Moody would limit academic freedom to faculty members who are exercising academic functions in a truly academic manner, in a truly academic manner, unquote. Unlike those who speak of a universal idea and the torch of freedom being carried everywhere, Moody is focused relentlessly on the adjective academic. He begins with it and reasons from it to the boundaries of the freedom academics can legitimately be granted. To be sure, the matter is not so cut and dried, for of course academic must itself be defined so that the boundaries can come into view clearly, and that is no easy matter. No one doubts that classroom teaching and research are activities where the freedom in question, whatever it is to be accorded, at least to some extent. But what about the freedom to criticize one's superiors, or the freedom to configure a course in ways not standard in the department, or the freedom to have a voice in the building of parking garages, or in the funding of athletic programs, or in the decision to erect a student center, or in the selection of a president of the university, or in the awarding of honorary degrees, or in the inviting to campus of outside speakers? Is academic freedom violated when faculty members have minimal input into, or are shut out entirely from, the consideration of these and other matters? What is exactly the scope of the freedom claim? To that question, Mark Udorf, now president of the University of California, but then a law school dean, gives a firm no. Udorf acknowledges, quote, that there are many elements necessary to sustain the university, including salaries, library collections, a comfortable workplace, even a parking space. But, he asks, do academics have a right to those things, or a right to participate in discussions about them? Only, says Udorf, if you believe that any restriction, however indirectly linked to teaching and scholarship, will destroy the quest for knowledge. And that, Udorf observes, would amount, and I quote him, to a kind of unbridled libertarianism for academics who could say anything they liked in a university without fear of reprisal or discipline. Better, Udorf concludes, to define academic freedom narrowly, if only so those who are called upon to defend it can offer a targeted and not a wholly diffuse rationale. For, and I quote him again, if academic freedom is thought to include all that is desirable for academics, it may come to mean quite little to policymakers and courts. And that has proved to be a prophetic statement. So now we have, as a working hypothesis, an opposition between two distinct views of academic freedom. In one, freedom is a general, overriding, and ever-expanding value that just happens to find a local instantiation in academic settings. And in the other, the scope of freedom is limited to and by the core duties of the academic profession. So the idea is that when performing those duties, the instructor is at least relatively free. When engaged in other activities, even those that take place within university precincts, no such freedom or special latitude obtains. Now, these opposed counts of academic freedom do not by any means exhaust the possibilities. There are extremes to either side of them, and in the pages that follow, I shall present the full range of the positions currently available. This field is in a fluid state. New variants and new theories continue to appear. When I say this field is in a fluid state, I am making what some of my colleagues in the liberal arts call a performative statement. This field is being brought into being by my announcement of it today. That is, I am hereby, there's a good performative word, I am hereby inaugurating a new field of study, academic freedom studies. And by the way, if I am successful in persuading you and similar audiences that there is such a field, there will soon, of course, be courses in academic freedom. There will then be a general program in academic freedom. There will then be a demand for a department of academic freedom studies, and soon perhaps, or at least within my lifetime, I hope, because I could then be the dean of it, a college of academic freedom studies. This is the way the academic world works, and isn't it a wonderful thing? Okay, so as I said, the field, as I said in a way that's almost comical, the field is in a fluid state. New variants and new theories continue to appear, but for the time being, we can identify, which means I can identify, 5 schools of academic freedom plotted on a continuum that goes from right to left. Now, any correlation, the continuum is obviously political, but the politics, at least at the outset, are the politics of the academy. Any correlation of the points on the continuum with real-world politics is imperfect. There's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but as we shall see, there is some. I should acknowledge at the outset that I shall present these schools as more distinct than they are in practice. Individual academics can be members of more than one of them. The taxonomy I offer is intended as a device of clarification. The inevitable blurring of the lines comes later, perhaps in the question and answer period. That would be a good time. Now, as an aid to the project of sorting out the 5 schools, which I quite obviously have not yet named, here is a list of questions that will receive different answers depending on which school of academic freedom is being adhered to. Here are some of the questions. 1, is academic freedom a constitutional right? And this is something very much debated in the literature, and 2 distinguished scholars, Robert Post, Dean of the Yale Law School, and J. Peter Byrne of the Georgetown Law Center, are among those who say that academic freedom is a constitutional right. They happen to be wrong, but they say it. Question 2, that is another question which often is posed in the literature. What is the relationship between academic freedom and the First Amendment? That's a very complicated question, which has received many subtle answers. Another question, what is the relationship between academic freedom and democracy? Which leads then almost immediately to still another question. Does academic freedom, whatever its scope, attach to the individual faculty member or to the institution? And that's both a philosophical question and an important legal question. And also, in this same little nest, Another question, what is the relationship between academic freedom and the form of governance at a college or university? And here we come upon the vexed topic of faculty governance, or it's sometimes called shared governance, and the declaration by some that you cannot have academic freedom unless you have a strong tradition of shared governance. Does academic freedom include the right of a professor to criticize his or her organizational superiors with impunity? And then a really big question, in what sense, if any, are academics special? And here I would make a distinction between special and different. That is, academics are different in any number of ways, in the kinds of work years they have, in the kinds of products that they do or do not have, in the kind of latitude they are given in terms of the time it takes to accomplish a project, all kinds of ways that academics are different. Just as almost any profession can mark out some differences between it and other professions. But the claim that academics are special is quite another kind of claim, and we'll see what is involved in that claim in a moment. Then there's an easy question, although it's often posed in the literature. Do students have academic freedom rights? The answer to that is a flat no. Students don't have any academic freedom rights. Does academic freedom allow a professor to rehearse his or her political views in the classroom? That is itself a politically charged question and continues to be so. And what is the relationship between academic freedom and political freedom? Another big question. And finally, what views of education underlie the various positions on academic freedom? These are all big questions, and again, the answers to them will vary depending on which of the schools I'm about to describe is in force. But before we get to the schools, as a further aid, it would be good to have in mind some examples or incidents or controversies in which academic freedom has recently been thought to be at stake. And all of you will be able to, many of you will be able to offer other examples. These are just meant to be representative. Last year in 2011, the faculty of John Jay College nominated playwright Tony Kushner to be the recipient of an honorary degree from the City University of New York. Normally, approval of the nomination would have been pro forma, but this time the CUNY Board of Trustees tabled and thus effectively killed the motion supporting Kushner's candidacy. And they did so because a single trustee objected to Kushner's views on Israel and Palestine. After a few days of outrage and bad publicity, the CUNY board met again and changed its mind, thereby illustrating one of my favorite principles. If a university screws up and tries to do something in response to the screw-up, it will screw up again. And if given another opportunity, will screw up a third and a fourth time. Universities almost never get it right. I don't know why, perhaps some of you. But in terms of that topic, academic freedom, was this, that is, first the denial of Kushner's candidacy and then its reinstatement after a lot of bad publicity, largely generated by the New York Post, was this a case first of the violation of Kushner's academic freedom and then of its reaffirmation 3 days later? Now, in the same year, 2011, different case, or example, John Michael Bailey, a professor at Northwestern University, invited a couple to perform a live sex act at an optional session of his course on human sexuality. The male of the couple, Bailey, thought that optional really took care of it for him. You know, God forbid these people, I don't know where they come from. The male of the couple brought his naked female partner to orgasm with the help of a device that he described as a fuck saw, which is one of those descriptions that actually does the job. Now, here's the academic freedom question. Should Bailey have been reprimanded and perhaps disciplined for bringing lewd behavior into his classroom, or should the invitation and the display both be regarded as a legitimate pedagogical choice and therefore, you guessed it, protected by the doctrine of academic freedom? Next case. In 2009, Professor William Robinson of the University of California at Santa Barbara, after listening to a Martin Luther King speech protesting the Vietnam War on tape, sent an email to his students in his Sociology of Globalization course. That email began, "If Martin Luther King were alive on this day of January 19, 2009, there is no doubt that he would be condemning the Israeli aggression against Gaza and also condemning the U.S. military and political support for Israeli war crimes. And he would also be standing shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinians," unquote. The email went on to compare the Israeli actions against Gaza to the Nazi actions against Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, and to characterize Israel, and I again quote, as a state founded on the negation of a people. Question: was Robinson's email an intrusion of his own political views into the classroom, or was it a contribution to the subject matter of his course, and therefore protected under the doctrine of academic freedom? Another case: BB&T, a bank holding company, funds instruction in ethics on the condition that the courses it supports include as a required reading Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I often think that this falls under the cruel and unusual punishment provision. So, if the university accepts this arrangement, as Florida State University did, has it traded its academic freedom for cash, or is it, as the dean at Florida State insisted, merely accepting help in a time of financial exigency? All right. And then a very, very important case, which some of you may know, it's the title of the case is Urofsky versus Gilmore. In 1996, the state of Virginia passed a law forbidding state employees from accessing pornographic materials on state-owned computers. The statute, however, included a waiver for those who could convince a supervisor that the viewing of pornographic material was part of a bona fide research project. And here the question is, was the academic freedom of faculty members in the state university system violated because they were prevented from determining for themselves and without government monitoring the course of their research? So those are a bunch of sample cases, a bit spectacular, but there are more humdrum instances, but I thought I'd give you an array of them. Just as my questions will be answered differently by proponents of different accounts of academic freedom, so will these cases be assessed differently depending on which school of academic freedom a commentator belongs to. So, again, I must acknowledge that I have yet to name the schools, and I will do that now. The first school is called the It's Just a Job School. This school, which may have only one member, and you're listening to him now, rests on a decidedly deflationary view of higher education. The It's Just a Job School contends that rather than being a vocation or a holy calling, higher education is a service that offers knowledge and skills to students who wish to receive them and are capable of receiving them. Again, in this view, those who work in higher education are trained to impart that knowledge, to demonstrate those skills, and to engage in research that adds to the body of what is known. These researchers and teachers are not exercising First Amendment rights. They are not forming citizens or inculcating moral values. They are not training soldiers to fight for social justice. Their obligations and aspirations are defined by the distinctive tasks they are trained and paid to perform. And for the members of the It's Just a Job School, trained and paid are very important verbs. Those tasks that they are trained and paid to perform are defined by contract and by the course catalog, and not by a vision of democracy or world peace. Again, in the eyes of the It's Just a Job School, academic faculty members are professionals, and as such, the activities they legitimately perform are professional activities. and that is activities in which they have a professional competence. When engaged in those activities, and only those activities, they should be accorded the latitude, you can call it freedom if you like, necessary to the proper performance of those activities. But that latitude does not include the performance of other tasks, no matter how worthy they might be. According to this school, academics are not free in any special sense to do anything but do their jobs. That's it. Now, the second school is called the For the Common Good School, and that's a phrase in the 1940 Declaration by the AAUP of the Principles of Academic Freedom and Tenure. This school, however, has its origins in the 1915 Declaration, and it shares some arguments with the For It's Just a Job School, especially the argument that the academic task is distinctive. Other tasks may be responsible to market or political forces or to public opinion, but the task of advancing knowledge involves following the evidence wherever it leads, and therefore, and I quote from the 1915 Declaration, the first condition of progress is complete and unlimited freedom to pursue inquiry and then to publish its results. The standards an academic must honor are the standards of the academic profession. Therefore, the freedom he enjoys depends on adherence to those standards. Again, I quote from the Declaration. The liberty of the scholar is to set forth his conclusions in a way that is conditioned by their being conclusions gained by a scholar's method and held in a scholar's spirit. That liberty cannot be used as a shelter for uncritical or intemperate partisanship, and a teacher should not inundate students with his own opinions, unquote. So far, the picture here would seem to be of a self-enclosed professional activity, a transaction between teachers, students, and a set of intellectual questions with no reference to larger moral, political, or societal considerations. But the opening to larger considerations is provided, at least potentially, by the asserted connection in the 1915 Declaration between academic freedom and democracy. Democracy, say the authors, requires, quote, experts to advise both legislators and administrators, and it is the university that will supply them and thus render a service to the right solution of social problems, unquote. Democracy's virtues, it is noted, are also the source of its dangers, for by repudiating despotism and political tyranny, democracy risks legitimizing the tyranny of public opinion. And at this point, the Academy rides to the rescue, and I am still quoting from the 1915 Declaration, rides to the rescue by working to help make public opinion more self-critical and more circumspect, working to check the more hasty and unconsidered impulses of popular feeling, working in effect to train the democracy, unquote. By thus offering an external justification for an independent academy, that is, the justification that it protects us from our worst instincts and furthers the realization of democratic principles, the For the Common Good School moves away from the severe professionalism, some would say the arid and empty professionalism, of the It's Just a Job School, and moves toward an argument in which professional values are subordinated to the higher values of democracy or justice or freedom, that is, to the common good. And here my argument is this: the moment you move away from professionalism to some larger notion of both the academy and academic freedom, you are necessarily subordinating academic goals and academic ways of doing things to something else. Now, that something else may be a grand and glorious thing, as democracy surely is. But the question is that what we should be doing in the academy? Subordinating the judgment of what we do to some grand abstraction that is not a matter of academic professionalism. Now, the For the Common Good School 3 leads quite naturally to the For the Uncommon Being School, which I sometimes call the School of Academic Exceptionalism. And perhaps that's the better word for it. This school is a logical extension of the former For the Common Good School by this reasoning. If academics are charged not merely with the task of adding to our knowledge, but also with the task of providing a counterweight to the force of common popular opinion, they, academics, must themselves be uncommon, not only intellectually, but morally. They must be, in the words of the 1915 Declaration, men of high gift and character, unquote. Such men, and now of course women, not only correct the errors of popular opinion, they escape popular judgment and are not to be held accountable to the same laws and restrictions that constrain ordinary citizens. Actually, by the logic of this position, why should they be? They're in the business of correcting popular opinion and refining it. Therefore, they should not be in any way judged by the bearers of popular opinion. The essence of this position, academic exceptionalism, is displayed by the plaintiff's arguments in Urofsky v. Gilmore, the case you will recall revolving around Virginia's law forbidding state employees from accessing explicitly sexual materials on state-owned computers without the permission of a supervisor. The phrase that drives the legal reasoning in this case is one that will be familiar to many of you. The phrase is a matter of public concern. In a series of decisions, the Supreme Court had ruled that if public employees speak out on a matter of public concern, their First Amendment rights come into play because they are acting as citizens, and those rights might outweigh the government interest in efficiency and organizational discipline. If, however, the speech in question is internal to the operations of the administrative unit, a personal complaint or something like it, no such protection is available. Now, the Urofsky court determined almost immediately that the ability of employees to access pornography was not a matter of public concern. That is, the public is not to be thought of as worrying lest public state employees be deprived of the opportunity to watch pornography. Now, the plaintiffs, professors in the same state university system, argued, and I quote, "Even if the act is valid as to the majority of state employees, it validates the academic freedom rights of professors and thus is invalid to them." In other words, you clerks, you assistant district attorneys, you custodians, you have to abide by this state law, but we're, kind of in the immortal words of the comedian Chevy Chase, which I now alter, we're professors and you're not. In short, we're exceptional beings. Now, what follows from that position, the academic freedom as exceptionalism school, is the academic freedom as critique school. For if academics have the special capacity to see through the conventional public wisdom and to expose its contradictions, exercising that capacity is, when it comes down to it, the academic's real job, as opposed, let's say, to producing a monograph on Byzantine art. Critique of everything is the continuing obligation of the academic. While the It's Just a Job school and the For the Common Good school insist that the freedom academics enjoy is exercised within the norms of the profession, those who identify academic freedom with critique because they identify education with critique object that this view reifies and naturalizes professional norms, which are themselves the products of history and as such are, or should be, challengeable and revisable. In short, one should not rest complacently in the norms and standards presupposed by the current academy's practices. One should instead interrogate the academy's norms and make them the objects of critical scrutiny rather than the baseline parameters within which critical scrutiny is performed. Behind this recommendation is a view of authority, academic or any other, as always suspect, both in its origins and in its operations. Academic freedom is understood as a protection for dissent, as a protection for dissent. Steve Schifrin has a view very much like this, law professor at Cornell, and the scope of dissent must extend to the very distinctions and boundaries the academy presently enforces. As the philosopher of this view of academic freedom, Judith Butler puts it, quote, "As long as voices of dissent are only admissible if they conform to accepted professional norms, dissent itself is limited, and so it cannot take aim at those norms that are already accepted," unquote. One of those norms enforces a separation between academic and real-world political urgencies, but Butler contends these are not so easily distinguishable, and the boundaries between them blur and change. Relying on boundaries drawn in the past has the effect of freezing the status quo, I'm still rehearsing Butler's argument, and of allowing distinctions originally rooted in politics to present themselves now as apolitical, as norms. The result, says Butler, can be a form of, quote, political liberalism that is coupled with a profoundly conservative intellectual resistance to innovation, unquote. From the perspective of critique, established norms are always conservative and therefore always suspect, and academic freedom exists so that they can be exposed for what they really are, and that's the academic's job. Academic freedom, in short, is an engine of social progress, and as such is the particular property of the left, because, of course, what conservatives are doing in this, I think, cartoon version of the story, what conservatives are doing are preserving the status quo, and it's up to us good liberal lefty academics to make sure that they don't get away with it. Now, it's only a short step from academic freedom as critique to my final school, School 5, academic freedom as revolution, or perhaps more precisely, academic freedom as training for revolution. With the emergence of this final school, the shift from academic as a limiting adjective to the word freedom as an overriding concern is complete, and the political agenda implicit in schools 2, 3, and 4 is made explicit. Butler wants to ask, where do the norms governing academic practices come from? The members of the academic school's revolution know where they come from. The norms come from the corrupt motives of agents who are embedded in the corrupt institutions that serve and reflect the corrupt values of a corrupt neoliberal society. No doubt many of you have heard statements like that. I hope that none of you has ever written one. But you never can tell. The view of education that lies behind and informs this most expansive version of academic freedom is articulated by Professor Henry Giroux. Quote, "The responsibilities that come along with teaching include fighting for an inclusive and radical democracy by recognizing that education in the broadest sense is not just about understanding. It is also about providing the conditions for assuming the responsibilities we have as citizens to expose human misery and to eliminate the conditions that produce human misery," unquote. In this statement, as you will have noted, the line between the teacher as a professional and the teacher as an activist citizen disappears. Education, quote, "in the broadest sense," unquote, demands positive political action on the part of those engaged in it, while adhering to a narrow view of one's responsibilities in the classroom amounts to betrayal both of one's political being and of one's pedagogical being. Academic freedom, declares Grant Farad of Cornell, another apostle of this view, quote, "has to be conceived as a form of political solidarity." And he doesn't mean solidarity with banks, corporations, pharmaceutical firms, oil companies, or for that matter, solidarity with universities. When university obligations clash with the overwhelming imperative of doing social justice always trumps. It follows, then, that one can only be true to the academy by breaking free of its constraints, which, of course, are illegitimate in their origin and also illegitimate in their present implementation. Now, the poster boy for the Academic Freedom as Revolution School is Denise Rencourt, a physics professor at the University of Ottawa, now removed from his position pending an appeal, who practices what he calls academic squatting. What is academic squatting? It's when you take a course with a title that appears in the catalog or in the online catalog and has an advertised subject matter, and you turn it into a workshop for revolutionary activity. That doesn't mean you turn it into a workshop studying revolutionary activity, which would be perfectly acceptable academic project, but you turn it into a workshop designed to produce little academic revolutionaries who will march out of your classroom and do the appropriate revolutionary things. Now, when asked what is the rationale for academic squatting, Rancourt replied, quote, "Academic squatting is needed because universities are dictatorships run by self-appointed executives who always serves the interests of capitalism," unquote. So there they are, the 5 schools of academic freedom, presented, I must acknowledge, somewhat abstractly. A fuller analysis will put flesh on these bones, and that's the analysis in the book as a whole. But as a preview to that analysis and as a conclusion, we can consider what the proponents of each of the schools might say about William Robinson, the sociology professor at UC Santa Barbara, who sent an email to his students comparing Israelis to Nazis and asserting that Martin Luther King would have stood with the Palestinians had he been alive. This time, instead of going from 1 to 5, that is from right to left, we'll go from 5 to 1, that is from left to right. So, what would the academic freedom is for revolution school members say? Well, that's easy. Professors like Giroux and Rancourt would cheer William Robinson on. For if it is the obligation of academics to oppose tyranny by whatever means and wherever tyranny is found, and if the means available to teachers include primarily their classrooms, then it makes perfect sense to spread the truth by telling it to their students and training their students to fight for that truth. Now, Judith Butler has not, to my knowledge, commented on the Robinson case, although she may have signed a petition of over 2,500 scholars supporting Robinson. But the names of the signatories have been removed from the petition's website. But she has declared herself on the question of university divestment from Israeli-affiliated stocks and companies, and she has declared herself on the question of whether or not it is appropriate to boycott Israeli institutions and, in some instances, Israeli scholars. Butler supports divestment, and she also supports the boycott. And in the course of giving her reasons, she invokes a distinction between anti-Semitic speech and, quote, speech which might make a student uncomfortable because it opposes a particular state or opposes a set of state policies that the student may wish to defend, unquote. So Butler might well regard, and I think she would regard, Robinson as a teacher who gives his students the gift of uncomfortable speech. And she would certainly resist the drawing of a bright line between political speech and academic speech on the reasoning, and I quote her, that although extramural expression, that is expression outside the confines of the university, might not be the same as academic expression, strictly it would seem that they are nevertheless joined as 2 different ways the public interest is served. And anyway, she adds, quote, it is not possible easily to distinguish between expression that is protected as academic freedom and expression that qualifies as extramural political expression. Any distinction that is asserted, she more than applies, is likely to mask a politics in the name of pushing politics away. Now, School 3 and William Robinson, it's for uncommon beings or academic exceptionalism. Some of those who believe that academic freedom is justified because academics are exceptional beings also believe that academics have the special capacity and responsibility to monitor and correct national opinion. Robinson, they might say, is merely living up to that responsibility when he urges on his students what he takes to be the truth about an important issue. But other proponents of academic exceptionalism are more purist. Their concern is to protect the uniqueness of academic work from the sullying touch of politics and other crassly instrumental forces. They might regard Robinson's email as providing an opportunity for those who are poised to invade and colonize the citadel of the academy. So this could go in two directions. But we do not have to guess. We come to school too. It's for the common good. We do not have to guess what the AAUP, the organization that pretty much invented academic freedom in this country and acts as its watchdog, would say about the Robinson case, because the AAUP issued a statement on the case, which was cited on February 9th, 2011 in the Santa Barbara Independent, and I read, "If an instructor cannot simulate discussion and encourage discussion by drawing analogies or parallels, the vigor and vibrancy of classroom discussion will be stultified." They are, of course, referring to the comparison between Israelis and Nazis. In a separate statement, the president of the AAUP, Carrie Nelson, amplified the official point. Quote, "Historical comparisons are protected by academic freedom, whether or not they were endorsed by a majority of other scholars, and even if the analogies are debatable, provocative, or reprehensible," unquote. Now, I should add, as an aside, that the AAUP was also troubled by the failure of the university to achieve an informal resolution of the Robinson matter. And they were even more troubled by alleged procedural irregularities committed by the university. And this last is no doubt a legitimate concern, given that no university I know of has ever been able to follow its own procedures. And that, I think, is a rule that you can take to the proverbial bank. So finally, we come to one. What does the "it's just a job" school have to say, that is, what do I have to say about Professor Robinson? Well, I would say that the incident was wrongly characterized by parties on both sides. Those who wanted Professor Robinson disciplined, mostly people from outside the academic community, said that anti-Semitic speech should not be tolerated in the university. Robinson's supporters replied that criticism of Israel was not anti-Semitic and that universities are places where controversies should be aired. But I would say that the issue is not whether Robinson's email was anti-Semitic or productive of healthy debate. The issue is whether the email was an academic communication or a political communication. And that is a question of motive, a question of intent. Was the analogy between Nazis and Israelis offered by Robinson in the spirit of vigorous discussion, or was it offered by him in the spirit of partisanship? Was it Robinson's intention to initiate an inquiry into the polemical uses of the Nazi-Israeli parallel, just as one might inquire into the polemical history of the cross or the American flag, or was his intention to affirm the identification of Israelis with Nazis and to urge it on his students? Fortunately, we don't have to speculate about the answer, since Robinson himself provided it in a speech explaining his actions. He describes his growing horror, I am quoting, as the siege of Gaza continued for weeks. He resolved, he tells us, to send his students a photo essay that juxtaposed Nazi atrocities against Jews and Israeli atrocities against Palestinians. He then claims that this and other items he emailed were to be material for classroom discussion. But the discussion's direction is indicated in advance by the commentary that was written accompanying those materials, and that was written, he boasts, quote, with passion and conviction. The commentary that begins, "Were Martin Luther King alive on this day?" It hardly needs saying that Robinson's passion was not for pedagogy, but for justice. Now, a passion for justice is, of course, a good thing. It's just not an academic good thing. And therein lies the entire essence of this position. In the debates about academic freedom, one point goes largely uncontroverted, and that is that inquiry, the conclusion of which is ordained before it begins, is not academic. It is something else. And because it is something else, it does not merit the protection of academic freedom. Professor Robinson's email was something else. It was not a contribution to scholarly inquiry, but a bypassing of scholarly inquiry in favor of politics. Robinson begins his speech explaining his actions by declaring, quote, that academic freedom is under attack at the University of California. Yes, it was, and in my view, he was leading the assault. Now, I am not saying that as an academic, you must stay away from highly charged political topics in your classroom. Only that when you introduce them, you ask your students to analyze, describe, and if appropriate, compare them, rather than ask them to take a stand on the issue the topics raise, or the issues the topics raise. The distinction I am making was explained long ago in 1918 with forceful clarity by Max Weber in his 1918 essay, Science as a Vocation. Quote, when speaking in a public meeting, one does not hide one's personal standpoint. The words one uses in such a public meeting are not means of scientific analysis, but means of canvassing votes and winning over others to your position. It would be an outrage, however, to use words in this fashion in a lecture or in the lecture room, unquote. The It's Just a Job School insists that in the classroom, everything is or should be under discussion in the way Weber describes. Or, to use a word that I coined some time ago, everything should be academicized. That is, everything should be regarded as an object of academic interrogation rather than as the occasion for political choice. So, it's perfectly okay to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its relationship to the Middle East and to World War II, its sources in Zionism and British imperialism, and 1,000 other things. What is not okay is to lead your students by methods either direct or indirect to come down on one side or the other of the conflict. Because as Weber more than implies, were you to do that, you would no longer be performing as an academic. You will have become a political agent for some cause, as William Robinson was when he sent the Martin Luther King email to his students. The imperative of academicizing demands the exclusion of no topic from the classroom. Any topic can be introduced. Anything is potentially a subject matter for academic interrogation. But it does demand that whatever topic you have selected for consideration be the object of analysis rather than the vehicle of a political agenda. That is what it means to be an academic. And an academic who does more, as Robinson claims to, is not exercising a glorious freedom, but betraying his profession. Thank you.
Professor Fish has agreed to take some questions, and there are microphones at each side, so please feel free to line up and where you say you're going to start blurring the lines.
No, they're going to blur the lines. I just drew the lines, you know, in a very stark and uncompromising way, but of course they can't remain so.
So thank you, Professor Fish, for a really interesting and edifying talk. I wanted to raise two questions. One, I was a little startled by the absence of the word tenure anywhere in your discussion, because tenure is probably the most important material manifestation of the notion of academic freedom, and more importantly, probably the single most important protector of it. You know, for every one case that ends up before the court, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other cases that it would not be worth the university's while to press because of the burden of proof imposed by tenure. That's not to say it's good or bad, but just somehow,
Right.
you know, from a pragmatic point of view, I think analyzing the institution of tenure is very important to this discussion. That's just an observation. I wanted to ask about your dismissal of two. It's for the common good. And as I recall, the major ground on which you dismissed it was that, of course, that turns academic freedom into nothing more than a means or an instrument to a different
Right.
end. And, of course, to a consequentialist, that's hardly a criticism. It's just a restatement of consequentialism. So suppose we could agree on whatever the notion of common good is, no small thing. Are you skeptical that any version of protecting academic freedom could, as an empirical matter, be important to promoting the common good, such that we might want to afford different and higher protections to some activities of academics than we would to someone who's just doing a job, another kind of job? That is, there's some kind of division of labor here.
Yeah. Well, those are both excellent questions. Let me take the first. I will say something in the course of the book of which this is the introductory chapter, at least part of the introductory chapter, about tenure. But what I say about tenure will be, I suppose, predictably deflationary. That is, I regard tenure as a guild protection that almost any worker in any field would desire. So I perfectly understand why academics, and I am, of course, one of them, want protections like tenure and other forms of protection, which in effect make the conditions of the workplace more favorable. It's just, I'm not sure why anyone should grant this. In other words, I too am pleased to find protections for tenure in the university, although, as we all know, those protections are being eroded by the emergence in full flower of what are sometimes called contingent faculty. But I cannot view the desire for tenure as anything more than a desire for a certain form of guild protectionism. Since it's my guild, I'm all for it. But if you ask for a larger defense, the kind of defense which would allow us as academics to raise the banner of tenure and to argue that it was somehow important to society or democracy or to the full and meaningful life, or whatever other grand phrase, I can't go along.
I wasn't asking
No.
for it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there is one.
No.
But it's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, it is where the rubber meets the road, but again, where the rubber meets the road often in contractual terms. That it seemed to me that right now, the rise of unionization in universities and colleges, something that I once opposed but no longer opposed. I once opposed it because I was a combination member of schools 2 and 3. I thought that this was not a vocation, this was not a job that I was performing with some kind of a holy vocation. Perhaps the word holy was in my mind because what I taught for the first 35 years of my career were text, poems, and prose works in the Christian tradition. So that's what I was dealing with day after day after day. I also thought that, of course, we were all uncommon beings in the university. To use a phrase of the poet John Keats's, we were of a finer tone. Well, I no longer think that, and I'm ashamed of ever having thought that. So tenure fine, so long as we can gain it. We're more likely to gain it and other protections these days by contract rather than making any kind of larger, grander argument. Now, whether, of course, the question, as you acknowledge, of whether one could find a common ground is a vexed one, and I've written about that, and I'm thoroughly convinced that there is no common ground to be found, and that whatever is, and this is a kind of Judith Butler-like point, whatever is nominated as the common ground turns out to be the common ground that favors some interests and disfavors some other interests. I cannot myself imagine an argument that would persuade me that the privileges that usually are attached to the phrase academic freedom, if granted, would rebound to the well-being of society. and this is just a repeat of my answer to your first question, I think it will rebound to the well-being of academics. And so that's all to the good if you are, like me, an academic. But I can't. I would even extend that to the areas that I've spent innumerable hours, impassioned hours. I have been for many years a Miltonist, that is a student and teacher of the poetry and prose of John Milton. Suppose Milton's studies were to disappear from the face of the earth tomorrow. Well, I would certainly be personally unhappy at such a distressing turn of events. I would be extremely unhappy, but I would be hard-pressed to say that the disappearance of Milton's studies, and therefore the availability of Milton, would be an enormous loss for the world. Something would take its place. That's just the way things are. I'm saying again and again to academics, here we are in a privileged position. We certainly are. Enjoy that position. Just don't think that you have a right to it. You have some kind of right rooted in, let's say, some moral position. So that's, I guess, my... now, I should say, I believe that the arguments made on behalf of either tenure or academic freedom in the public square could be useful to our cause if they were made not in deflationary terms, my terms, but in highly resonant terms. I just don't think that I could honestly make any of them, and I'm not sure that I believe those of my colleagues who make them. Therefore, my counsel is always to hire public relations firms to make them, because they're not committed to the arguments they make, they're just committed to making them effectively. And that seems to me a good idea. This goes along with the big question, which is a question not only central to academic freedom, but central to academic work in general, and that is the question of justification. How can you justify academic work? Not how can you justify it in terms of, let's say, the economic benefit it brings to a state. All of those arguments are hopeless. The people who make them must sense the strain that they are exerting when making them. I think also that when you're asked for justification, you are almost always, in fact, I would say always, being asked to justify what you do in the other fellow's terms. Someone says to me, justify what you do. Doesn't mean tell me what you do and initiate me into its values, but justify what you do in accordance with my values. Once you accept that challenge, you've lost the game. To employ a sports analogy, you're playing on the other guy's court, and you're going to lose. So never justify. Never justify. There is no justification for the academy, no general justification for the academy. It is a miracle of sorts that people have paid me, and paid me quite well, over the years to teach poems by George Herbert or chapters in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. But that's what it is. It's a miracle, a piece of extraordinary good fortune, and that I was good enough to be alive at the appropriate time to enjoy. That's it.
Thank you for a fascinating and timely talk. Two things. I'm curious in starting Startup World University in School, which is like Wikipedia with MIT OpenCourseWare, about the role of possibility of creating an academic freedom study subject, wiki subject, which we could all edit. We'll add this talk to it. Look at MIT OpenCourseWare, see if there's OpenCourseWare about academic freedom sort of foci. And curious how you might conceptualize the legacy of both wiki in terms of knowledge generation and MIT OpenCourseWare, 2,100 courses online that are Creative Commonsly licensed. in your thinking about academic freedom. And the second question has to do with your conceptualization of academic vis-a-vis your politicization of this question in a very postmodern way versus perhaps the justification question you were just asking, where one definition might be of knowledge generation, that the academy comes out of a long sort of tradition of conversation around ideas, which the academic freedom and lack thereof then impedes.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, good, thank you very much. What was the postmodernist bit again?
What was the postmodern?
You mentioned, or I think accused me of being a postmodernist.
I'm thinking that the political perspective on academic freedom versus maybe a knowledge generation perspective is a very postmodern way of looking at things.
It is. If so, I'll have to re-examine it because I don't want to be that. There are a lot of things I don't want to be, and being seen as a postmodernist is one of them. Look, it's certainly true that a defense, or not a defense, a description of what should go on in the academy is that it's a knowledge-generating institution where people sit around, or if they're in laboratories, perhaps stand around and discuss ideas or proposals and try to prove them out. I think that that's a perfectly good description of what should, and often does, go on in a university. But then the question will come from someone who is not an academic. So what's in it for me? Why is it good for me? Why is it good for me and my friends and my family or my small business or my little club or association? The answer to that question doesn't seem to me to be clear at all. Because the truth is that almost everything that academics can offer in some fashion is available in other venues, perhaps not exactly in the same form. That is, in the humanities, there are innumerable poetry festivals, Shakespeare festivals, pottery festivals, book clubs, little local concerts, theater companies, et cetera, where if you have a taste for that kind of thing, you can indulge the taste. As far as scientific research, we all know that there are industries that are more than willing to shoulder the burden of scientific research and produce the kind of knowledge that will better our lives by technology and medical research. So I don't see why the university has to exist for the reason that it provides a space for such intellectual germination, as the 1915 Declaration says. The world could do without the university, too. But I would say if there's going to be a university world, a college world, an academic world, then it should, in fact, have just the shape and form that you describe. It should be a place where ideas and projects and experiments are tried out. For what reason? Because the bunch of people sitting around in these various academic spaces like to do that. That's it. They like to do that. It's the kind of thing that they like to do. If I didn't think you'd all run away sooner than you were going to run away, I would stand here and give you a 2-hour lecture on the poetry of George Herbert. Believe me, I could do it. In fact, a 4-hour lecture, if you preferred. It's the kind of thing I like to do, reading George Herbert and talking about him, his poetry, that is. It's the kind of thing I like to do. And this, again, the idea that there's a place where I can do it and be compensated for it is marvelous. Now, as for the legacy of Wiki and of the MIT Open Course Program, or in general, you weren't at my lunchtime talk. Yes. Well, I gave a talk on what is now called the digital humanities. Actually, it was a talk on the digital humanities and legal interpretation. But a lot of it was on the digital humanities. And a point that I made, not in the talk, but in a comment afterwards, is that I think that academic freedom could not survive the kind of world envisioned by open course university and other democratizing impulses that we find in the digital world, impulses which are attached to some extent to the promise of democratization, which has been claimed for the internet from its very inception. Now, were this to be realized, were this vision to be realized, this what has been called this techno-utopian vision, were to be realized, and there would be no more there would be no more chaired professors and aspiring junior professors, and even more aspiring graduate students. And at the bottom of the pyramid, undergraduate students with their wonderful faces upturned to you as you delivered the pearls of wisdom to them. If there weren't this entire exclusionary structure in which it's the whole point of the academy to figure out how to keep some voices out so that other voices could be heard loud and clearly and in a privileged position. If that weren't in place, then the whole notion of academic freedom would make no sense. Or, to say the same thing, everyone would have academic freedom, and therefore the phrase wouldn't mean anything. Academic freedom only works within a structure that is an academic structure in which most people in the world are kept out. That's, in fact, the function institutionally of the university, and academic freedom is an extension of that university function. Now, I should say, and this is a point that I try to stress, although I'm always sure that I will not persuade anyone by it, I am in no way being cynical. There is not a cynical bone in my body. No way being cynical. I'm just trying to describe to you the way in which the academy works. Now, a lot of people who work in the digital humanities and other general projects on the left and recognize that the truth in my account or someone else's account of the way the university works, then throw up their hands in horror. And they say, oh, we can't have this. We can't have exclusionary structures. We can't just have a few people acting as gatekeepers. We can't have all of these voices yearning to get in, but they're not allowed to get in. Well, if we can't have that, we can't have the academy, and we can't have academic freedom. So if you're for what I call the orgy of democratization of everything, then I'm your worst nightmare.
So I too like the "it's just a job" approach, although I think it allied somewhat into the second one.
Yeah, that's true.
And like Barbara Fried, I also would come to this from a consequentialist view rather than thinking this is some right created somewhere above. But I think I have a less cramped view of the "it's just a job" view than you do.
It would be hard not to.
So it seems to me that if it's just a job, then different universities or different colleges can define the job in different ways, and I think that's okay. There are some institutions that just define it as a teaching job, some, like Rockefeller University, I suppose, that defines it just as a research job. But let's take, since we're at Stanford, sort of a private major research university where it thinks the jobs are somewhat related, and it actually thinks the research job is for the common good in some way. That is, the reason for advancing knowledge, whether it's about Renaissance poets or physics or law, is ultimately for the advancement of society. So if you take that view, and suppose you think that the teaching and research missions are happily joined at a research university, you might allow, I can't remember the name of the protagonist in the anti-Israeli rant, but you might say, all things being equal, it's better not to question his motivation, to let him say this to his students, either in furtherance of the teaching or the research agenda if you think they're conjoined, because once you begin looking at people's motivations one by one, you're likely to restrict more speech than you want to. So I could agree with you that his motivation may actually not be in furtherance of the mission, but in some ways the same reason that we think that libel laws in Singapore, for example, suppress freedom of the speech too much. You might just decide it's too suppressive, so it's better to let him do this for what may not be good motives in terms of our consequentialist approach to "it's just a job" but still let him do it?
Well, I think that's a very rich question, and I should say that in terms of First Amendment theory, I myself am a consequentialist, rather than a deontologist or someone who's operating on principle. But to go directly to the issue of Professor Robinson in his email and his intention, it seems to me that you have to realize, or I would ask you to realize, that some of the students in his class, and some did protest, but only a small number of those in his class protested because they felt that they were being told that by their professor that a certain set of views were considered obviously correct, and certain other views that they may have held were obviously incorrect. It seems to me that's the wrong thing to do in a classroom, unless the views in question are academic in a strict sense. For example, the question that has animated Milton studies since 1712, when the essayist Addison raised it, is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost? That question is still one of the premier questions in Milton studies, being debated all the time in books and essays. Now, let's say that you are, as I am, a professor of English literature whose specialty is Milton. And I believe firmly that the answer to the question, is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost, is no. And I give reasons for that in my class. I think that in giving reasons for that position and holding to that position and critiquing other positions, I am engaging in a proper academic judgment, because the question of whether or not Satan is the hero of Milton's Paradise Lost is not a question in the public domain. To put it another way, when, let's say, one of my colleagues in the Milton profession, or in Milton studies rather, himself says yes to the question, is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost, he is not teaching his students to be Satanists in the bad sense of the word. He is teaching his students or instructing his students as to his view on what is the right answer to an interpretive literary question. That's quite a different matter. But on the other hand, if you are proclaiming your political views on a matter that is a live matter before the public, before the world at the moment, you are in fact instructing your students to be certain kinds of persons, as opposed to instructing them to have a certain view of a literary work. And I think that is an easy, perspicuous, and to me at least, powerful distinction. Now, as for the idea that you might allow Robinson, which in fact is what happened, the inquiry, the AAUP and the university inquiry into his conduct entirely cleared him of any wrongdoing. I believe that that was an outrageous conclusion, but I should report that it was the conclusion, and I believe it was a conclusion based on an imperfect understanding of what was at stake in the question. But if you allowed him to make statements that were not in fact statements, or if you allowed him to perform as a political agent when he was being paid to perform as an academic agent, then any potentially good consequences that might ensue from allowing him to do so would, in my mind, be outweighed by the fact that you were tainting the project. You were tainting the project. I go so far as to say, and I'm not the only one who has said this, I think I may have said it first, but that's really immaterial. If you have on your bulletin board or on your office walls posters or other material indicating your political or ideological preferences, you should take them down immediately. They don't belong there, because your office is an extension of the scene of instruction. And in the scene of instruction, again, your students should not enter your door, look at your walls, and then know that certain views are required here and other views are frowned upon. And it's a very nice line that can be drawn. It's not even hard to draw it. and I myself cannot see any beneficial consequences. Now, as for the question of that you will restrict more speech than you might want to, I myself have never yet reached the limits of the amount of speech I might want to restrict. In this, I stand foursquare with my favorite philosopher, Thomas Hobbes.
So I'm afraid our time is up, so it's my
It is?
pleasure to restrict
Oh.
Professor
Would-
Fish's speech as we go forward, but there is a reception outside, and so folks will have
Well, let me thank you all very much for attending and participating. I very much appreciate it. I've had a wonderful visit here at Stanford. It's a great institution, and you're fortunate to be a part of it. Thank you.